Hi, it's Dana Marie, and today I'm going to be working with fold over elastic. Here's a few tips that I like to use. I do want to pre-shrink my knits because they have a tendency to shrink. I do not pre-fold my elastic, and I sew in a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning the neckline and the elastic are the same. Definitely use a stretch needle, and if you have access to stretchable thread, it's a great way to have easy knits. Here's a little sample I did, showing you just a simple straight stitch using the stretchable thread. Unfortunately, it doesn't come in a lot of colors, so I'm going to demonstrate using both stretchable thread and regular thread. But it is a great product, especially when you're using knits. Look at that stretch with just a straight stitch. Amazing! So let's get started. If I'm going to be binding, the first thing I want to do is trim away any seam allowances. When I'm applying the fold over elastic, I will simply lay it underneath. It has that great little fold line right in the middle. You can use either side. One side shiny and the other side's a matte finish. So I will just get started. Now sometimes when you're starting right on an edge like that, things want to just get stoppered up. That's where I use my ballpoint awl and help things feed smoothly right at the beginning of a seam. Take a few stitches and then I can adjust, and see how I'm just going to lay that edge of the garment right on that line that's in the middle of my fold over elastic. It's just as simple as that. If you have your garment right on that line, not over it, not too far away from it, you'll be sure to catch both sides of the elastic. I think that's probably the biggest hiccup that people have, is that when they straight stitch it on like this, sometimes they'll miss the back side. But notice how I'm not pre-folding my elastic, I'm not pressing it down. And the reason I don't do that is because I want to be able to steam shrink later, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So just continue to take a few stitches. I generally sew 3 or 4 inches and then readjust and go again. There it is. And because of the contrast thread, you can see that I've covered both the back side and the front side. An amazing stretch because I used my stretchable thread. Now another question I often get is, how do you finish those edges when they two meet? Because the fold over elastic is fairly thick, I will use the same miter technique I use for other bindings. That little piece is what I'm going to use to measure where my binding is. So I will just lay that end of the fold over elastic, and now I'm using that little piece as a guide. It's basically using it the same width. You can set those aside. And now the trick is I'm going to sew those together. But I want to sew them in a mitered seam, meaning a bias seam across, because then it blends smoothly, there's less bulk. Make sure you put them right sides together and then just turn it at an angle because you're going to be sewing across. Now here's a trick that I like to use. I will take a pin and just do a little faux stitching, basically, I like to call it, because this will make sure that I can do it right. Whoops, that's not going to work. Because I just pinned it and didn't already stitch it, I can simply remove the pin and just go from the other angle. Better safe than sorry and having to pull things out. Perfect. Now it works. This is how I tie a little knot in thread. A little bit of spit, roll it against my finger, and just pull the knot to the end. My mom taught me that one. Now, I normally don't like hand sewing anything, but for this miter, because it's not like regular cotton binding fabric, it's stretchable, and the edges are finished, so you want to make sure those two miters are perfect. right along the edge because there's no fudging. Everything's going to show. So I will simply just hand sew that angled seam. It's just a few stitches, and then I have a lot more control because I'm doing it by hand. If I were to stick this under my sewing machine, sometimes it doesn't work so good. And it's such a short little distance that you're going across, it's just easier and you have more control by doing it by hand. So making that nice little mitered seam, and then I can double check it. See how my edges now match up? Guaranteed if you put it underneath the machine. I have yet to be successful at that. Every once in a while I try it to see if I can do it, but it's just easier and I have more control, and I know it's going to work every time if I just hand sew that across. And because you're going to be stitching it to your garment, it's not going to pull out. You basically are just putting the two ends together. I will trim the seam allowance away to remove as much bulk as possible, and so nothing peeks out. Perfect. Now I'm ready to just stick it back underneath my machine and finish sewing that neckline. I like to make sure that my little miter seam is not right on, like here on the shoulder seam, because then you have all that bulk right in one place. So I just move it to one side or the other, just so it's not right on top of the same bulk of the shoulder seam in the garment. Just everything lays a lot nicer. So that's how I connect my fold over elastic. Next up, when I do the side seams, this is a little tank top. I don't bother mitering underneath there, but I will start my seam and I will back into it. See how I'm going backwards? And then I will go forward. If you back into the seam, it's less likely. Have you ever stuck a seam under there and then you start forward and it doesn't match up now because you've pushed the garment, the seam? I've serged my raw seam allowances, and then I just use a large eye needle so I can grab those little thread chains and I'm going to bury them into the seam allowance. I just like finishing it off this way. Make sure it's nice and I don't have like little loose threads always poking out. It's just an added little touch, and I can tug that right down into the seam allowance. Just snip the excess off, and I'm ready to go. I like tacking down the top of that just so it's not poking out, because it's a little small serge seam, and I will just put it underneath my machine and do a little bar tack. And then it's done. And that holds that top of that seam, so right underneath the arm it feels good. Little bar tack, simple. Here's my neckline after I've stitched it, kind of wobbly. I just steam press it and it's back into place. You can see how close I can get with a straight stitch. And here's my finished tank. So next I'm going to show you an alternate method, using just regular thread and a zigzag stitch. This time I'm going to use my curve runner, and I'm going to measure my neckline so that I can make my fold over elastic in a complete circle, meaning I've already sewn that mitered seam. I just wanted to show you another way to do it. I love these curve runners because I can measure curves perfectly. So I've pre-made my neckline, and now I'll apply the elastic in the same manner by folding it around the edge, but now I'm going to use a zigzag stitch and regular thread. Sometimes you just can't find the stretchable thread in a color that matches what you're working with. so you need to use regular thread. I can straight stitch with regular thread, and I have to allow a little bit more pulling on the garment so that I can continue to get stretch in my elastic and my garment. But you can also use a zigzag stitch, so that's what I'm doing here. I tend to like just a regular zigzag as opposed to a 3-step zigzag, because the more stitching that you have in there, like with the 3-step, it tends to stretch out your elastic a little bit much. And because I made my fold over elastic in a complete circle, I can sew it right to my neckline. I'm just going to trim away some of those extra threads. I hate sewing over them and then they get caught in the seam. But now I can continue to sew that complete neckline in one whole circle. I didn't have to stop and do a miter while I have the garment in place. It just gives you another option. But you do need to pre-measure and make your binding to fit. So I just zigzag around, getting right to the end. And again, it will be, as you can see, there's more wobbles with the zigzag, but I can steam press it and it'll lay flat. You can see that it adds a little bit of embellishment with the zigzag and is a great way to finish up this little tank top. I hope this video showed you how easy it is to sew with fold over elastic. It's a great way to finish the edges on your garments. I also invite you to join my private Facebook group, Sewing with Dana Marie. And you can find all kinds of great supplies at thesewingplace.com. Thanks for watching!